One of the central themes of my work is how space is constructed through stories, through history, and through culture of that location, and then how that sort of manifests itself in pop culture, in social media, in the way that we interact with the landscape, and seeing the distance that's created between the history before and the history present. So I look at the history of photography, the history of film and visual culture, as well as local history, to see how these individual experiences have been disseminated to the masses, and then how the masses are then interacting back with that landscape. And then I then create images based off of that relationship. So I start by going into the archives to see what imagery has been created, to look at the history of those locations, and I go on a journey to these places, usually by myself, where I then interact with locals, interact with people there, interact with tourists, to see why they are here, and then use that information to then create or to stage a self-portrait where I then insert myself into that landscape. I'm often looking for places where, in particular in the American West, and dealing with the history of the United States, looking at sort of how Black history has been left out, and finding ways to reintroduce those stories, the stories of Black people who are living in these regions, of the indigenous, of the Mexican, of the Chinese railroad workers, who were all a part of constructing the American West and what ideally became the United States, but are not then reflected in the legacy of photography that has taken place since that construction. First started off by photographing someone else, and I realized that the images were always going to be interpreted by the figure, and I didn't want to subject other people to that criticism or that interrogation that was happening. So then I then put myself in that place, and I made a purpose choice to wear a specific outfit, so that there's consistency in the series, no matter when I'm working on this project, whether it is, right now when I'm 32 or when I'm 60. And then the conversation comes about, well, what are we each looking at in this space? Because although you are looking at me, I'm not looking at you. And there's not a guarantee that we're both looking at the same thing. When I first started in thinking and considering the landscape, I was really interested in how our relationship to spaces is dictated based off of where we grew up, where we live, and that affects our understanding of the value of that landscape. But in thinking about the landscape, I was really interested in the fact that every sort of culture has a landscape that they hold value to, that sort of represents their sort of cultural values. But like, what is that with the United States? And then as someone who comes from a background or a legacy of slavery, where this is not my land, what then is my relationship as a Black body in this space to that landscape and that history? That history that has always sort of excluded us from that narrative, but yet we are here and we are sort of in this in-between space, and how we relate to that landscape. And so then what does that landscape mean to sort of Black individuals in this space? Does it still hold the same value and the same weight? I mean, one of the questions that I'm interested in is, when it comes to history, is who gets to be the storyteller, who gets to own history. And even going to, say, like a national park, in a space like that, someone has decided the road and the path that you go through. So who gets to decide the path that then dictates how we all experience the space and the myths that come out of that? And so I'm interested in asking sort of like, well, where does that begin? And what has changed over time? And is it true to the history of that space? And so when I think about erratic fields, and with my work, it's looking at sort of like, okay, we have this narrative that's been put over the landscape. What are these sort of wildflowers that are popping up in the midst of that are the histories of those who were there previously, their stories, their lived narratives that are still finding ways to sort of present themselves through it, whether it is petroglyphs, whether it is, found imagery or first-person accounts, that sort of show us that whatever view we think we have is not stable. right? So then it's always shifting with that. And so then with my own work, it is looking at sort of how photography and film have created certain narratives, certain visuals, certain icons. But does that hold up when you go to the space and you see that, okay, like this isn't this sort of thing, or this framing has left out all these other things behind it that completely change how we sort of relate to the space. And then now questions become like, well, why this view of that field? What is that doing?